Let me tell you about a Saturday morning in September that a few hundred people in rural Shropshire will likely never forget. It was the kind of morning that comes once or twice a year in that part of England. Cool and still. The kind where sound carries farther than it should. Where you can hear a gate latch from 2 fields over. The Ludlow County Fairground was already dressed for the occasion. Bunting strung between wooden posts, the smell of bacon rolls drifting from a white catering van, and that particular electricity that small English agricultural shows carry in their bones. People had driven in from villages you won't find on most maps. Farmers in weathered wax jackets, young families with children on shoulders, old men who came for no other reason than they remembered what a working tractor used to sound like. By 8 in the morning, there were maybe 300 people arranged along a rope barrier beside a freshly marked pull lane. 200 feet of packed chalk and dry clay, running straight as a promise from one end of the main field to the other. The event was a tractor pull. Now, if you've never been to one of these, here's what you need to understand. A tractor pull is exactly what it sounds like, and simultaneously nothing like what you'd expect. 2 machines are connected by a single steel chain to a weighted sled anchored at the center. Both tractors face outward from the sled in opposite directions. On the signal, they pull. Whoever moves the sled to their side, or pulls further in 60 seconds, wins the round. Best of 3. It sounds simple. It is, and it isn't. The event had been organized by a man named Robert Ashby, who ran the fairground committee and had been trying for 3 years to find something that would bring the crowds back after the pandemic had hollowed out attendance. He'd had the idea of pitching old working machinery against new commercial equipment as a kind of living argument. A conversation between eras, settled in the only way farmers respect, by the work itself. He'd found his 2 competitors through separate channels, and when he told each of them who they'd be facing, neither one backed out. That tells you something about both of them. The first man to arrive, and I want you to hold this image, came alone. His name was Clement Radford. Everyone called him Clem. He was 76 years old, built like a man who had spent 6 decades lifting things that needed lifting, with hands the color of old oak, and a face that had been rained on so many times it had simply decided to keep that expression permanently. He lived on a small holding outside the village of Clune, about 18 miles west of Ludlow, on land his grandfather had farmed before him. He arrived at 10 minutes past 5 in the morning, before the sun had fully committed to rising, driving an old flatbed trailer with the Marshall traction engine loaded and chained on the back. He parked without fuss, spoke to no one, and began unloading on his own with a series of practice movements that suggested this was not his first time and would not be his last. The machine itself deserves its own introduction. The Marshall was built in 1912, not the 1900s. 1912. Let that land. It was manufactured in Gainsborough, Lincolnshire, by Marshall Sons and Company, a firm that had been building steam-powered agricultural engines since the 1840s. The machine weighed just under 6 tons. It ran on coal and water, produced somewhere between 38 and 42 horsepower at its working peak, and had iron rear wheels with lug cleats, long curved iron spurs bolted around the rim that were designed to dig into soil rather than roll over it. It had no cab, no suspension, no electronics of any kind. It had a pressure gauge, a regulator, a firebox, and a boiler. It had a throttle that responded to a man's hand, and a steam chest that had been warming and cooling for over 100 years. Clem had owned it for 31 years, and his father had owned it for 20 before that. He didn't rush. He didn't talk to the media liaison who came over at 6:30 with a clipboard. He lit the firebox, checked the boiler pressure, polished a section of the casing with a cloth he kept in his breast pocket, and waited. Waiting, it was clear, was something Clem Radford was very good at. The second man arrived at 9:15. His name was Derek Holt. Derek was 43 years old from Telford and owned 4 farms and an agricultural machinery dealership that he'd built from his father's single lot into something that turned over several £1,000,000 a year. He was not a bad man. I want to be clear about that. He was sharp, competitive, and successful in the way that certain people are successful, by working relentlessly and assuming that results are a direct product of investment. He believed in data. He believed in engineering. He believed that if you bought the best and used it correctly, you would win. And he had enough evidence in his life to feel justified in that belief. He arrived in a convoy. There was a horsebox-style trailer, purpose-modified, carrying the tractor. There was a logistics van with 3 support crew in matching polo shirts. There was a communications person. There was someone whose entire job that morning appeared to be managing a social media feed on a tablet. And there was the tractor itself, a Fendt 940 Vario, current model, in its unmistakable green and black livery, 580 horsepower, continuously variable transmission, traction control, automatic wheel slip management, electronic differential lock, satellite positioning, and a touchscreen terminal in the cab that could, if you asked it to, tell you the fuel consumption of every field pass you'd made in the last calendar year. It was, by any technical measure, an extraordinary machine. Derek stepped out of the passenger seat of the van wearing a clean jacket with a small sponsor's logo on the chest, and he looked at the Marshal the way some people look at things in antique shops, with a kind of amused fondness that's really just another word for dismissal. He said it loud enough for people nearby to hear. He said, "Someone's brought a museum piece." A few people laughed. Most didn't. Clem, who was 60 feet away adjusting the coal feed on his firebox, did not look up. Robert Ashby gathered everyone at 9:45. He read the rules slowly and clearly. 2 machines, 1 chain, 1 sled. Best of 3 rounds, 60 seconds per round. No external assistance during a round. No interference with the opposing machine. The crowd settled into the kind of quiet that only arrives when people sense something real is about to happen. Both machines rolled forward to the chain. The Marshal exhaled a slow breath of steam into the September air. The Fendt idled with a low, controlled hum. 300 people leaned forward. And that is where this story truly begins. But here's what none of those 300 people yet understood. This was never just a story about horsepower. It was a story about what kind of knowledge survives, and how, and why. And to understand that, you have to watch what happens next. The signal was a single air horn, operated by Robert Ashby from the side of the pull lane. It sounded at 10 o'clock exactly. And for the first 3 seconds, exactly what everyone expected happened. The Fendt moved. Not aggressively. Derek was too experienced for that. Too precise, but with the kind of deliberate, controlled authority that 580 horsepower produces when it is properly managed. The rear tires, each one nearly 6 feet tall and loaded with a calcium chloride solution to add ballast weight, pressed into the packed chalk and bit. The chain between the 2 machines went from slack to taut in an instant. And the sound it made, a deep, resonant clank that you felt in your chest before you heard it with your ears, rolled across the fairground like a starting pistol. The Marshal moved backward. Not fast, not dramatically, but it moved. 2 feet, then a third, the iron lug cleats scoring shallow lines in the dry surface as the old machine was dragged, slowly but unmistakably, toward the fence end of the lane. The crowd made the sound crowds make when they see the thing they already believed confirmed. A low, collective exhale, a few murmurs. Someone near the rope barrier said, "There it is," the way you say it when a prediction lands. Derek's crew said nothing, but the communications person was filming. And then Clem did something. He didn't increase power. He didn't panic. He didn't look at the crowd or at Derek's machine or at the chalk lines his own wheels were cutting into the ground. He looked at the pressure gauge, one brief, practiced glance, and he moved his right hand about 2 inches along the steam regulator. Not a dramatic movement. The kind of movement a man makes when he's done something 10,000 times and no longer needs to think about the mechanics of it. Only the result. The Marshal stopped, not slowed. Stopped. The backward movement ceased so cleanly that several people near the front of the crowd actually stepped forward to see if something had broken or snagged. It hadn't. The old engine had simply found its footing. The lug cleats, those long curved iron spurs, had reached the angle in their rotation where they were pressing straight down into the surface rather than skimming across it. And the steam pressure, now held at exactly the right level by Clem's adjustment, was feeding torque to the wheels in a steady, unbroken rhythm. For the remaining 53 seconds of round 1, neither machine moved the chain by more than 6 inches in either direction. When the horn sounded again, Robert Ashby walked the chain, measured from the center marker, consulted briefly with the 2 line judges, and announced the result in a voice that carried genuine surprise. Round 1, a draw. The silence that followed lasted about 4 seconds, which is a long time for 300 people to say nothing. Then it broke all at once, not into cheering exactly, but into the sound of people turning to each other with the same question on their faces. Did that just happen? Clem climbed down from the Marshal with the unhurried movement of a man descending a ladder he knows well. He walked to the front of the machine, checked the chain hook, and then stood with one hand resting on the warm iron casing, not celebrating, not performing, just present. Derek sat in the fence cab for a moment before climbing out. His expression had changed. The easy amusement was gone. What replaced it was something more useful: focus. Derek Holt had not built a successful business by failing to adapt. He recognized a problem when it appeared, and he treated it the way he treated all problems, as something to be solved with the right information and the right tools. He had 30 minutes between rounds. He used them. His support crew gathered at the rear of the Fent. One of them was on a knee beside the back left tire with a pressure gauge. Another had a laptop open on the tailgate of the logistics van, connected to the tractor's onboard diagnostic system via a short cable. Derek himself was on his phone, not making a call but scrolling through data, the kind of real-time telemetry readout that the fence management system logs during operation. Wheel speed, torque output, slip percentage by axle, ground reaction force estimates. The machine had been measuring itself the entire time it was working, and Derek was reading what it had found. He made two decisions. First, he dropped the tire pressure by 6 pounds per square inch on both rear wheels. Lower pressure means a larger contact patch, more rubber touching the ground at once, more grip on a hard, dry surface. It's a well-understood technique, and on this particular ground, compact, dry, almost concrete-like in its resistance. It was a sound calculation. Second, he recalibrated the traction control threshold through the cab terminal, raising the point at which the system would intervene to manage wheel slip. He wanted the tires to work harder before the electronics stepped in to moderate them. More aggression, more grip, more pull. It was good thinking. Round 2 began and Derek implemented it perfectly. The Fent came out with more authority this time. Still controlled, but with a different quality to its effort. Something more committed. The wider contact patch did exactly what the physics promised. On that dry, packed chalk, rubber gripped better than iron. The Marshall's lug cleats, designed for softer soil where they could dig and anchor, found nothing to purchase on the hard surface. They pressed and rotated, but the ground gave them no resistance to push against. The chain moved, slowly, then steadily. The weighted sled shifted toward Clem's end of the lane. He worked the regulator. He made adjustments. He was not outclassed in terms of skill or composure. You could see that clearly if you were watching his hands instead of the chain. But the ground was against him, and a man working with the ground's limitations can only do so much when the ground simply will not cooperate. At 41 seconds, Robert Ashby stopped the round. The sled had crossed the line. Round 2 to Derek Holt. The crowd responded differently this time. Louder, more released. The tension of the first round surprise had been building, and this felt like the restoration of the expected order. Derek's communications person captured the moment. Someone near the barrier shouted something that was meant as a compliment to Derek and arrived as an insult to Clem. And several people around them went quiet in the uncomfortable way people do when a line gets crossed at a public event. Derek, to his credit, didn't acknowledge it. Clem, for his part, showed nothing. He climbed down from the Marshall for the second time. And this is the part that people who were there still talk about when they describe that day. He didn't go to the water station. He didn't speak to anyone. He walked to the rear of his machine, crouched down, and pressed the flat of his right hand against the surface of the pull lane. Not briefly. He held it there, palm flat, for perhaps 15 or 20 seconds. Then he moved forward 3 feet and did it again. Then again, closer to the center line. People nearby watched him without understanding what they were watching. Then he went to the toolbox fixed to the side of the Marshall, a battered iron box that had been bolted to that same machine since before most of the crowd had been born. And he took out a wrench. It was hand-forged, old, the kind of tool you don't see in catalogs anymore. He moved to the rear axle, crouched again, and made an adjustment that took him about 4 minutes and no visible effort. Methodical, deliberate, quiet. No one knew what he'd done. Then Clement Radford, 76 years old, walked the length of the pull lane to where Derek Holt was standing with his crew, and he extended his hand. Derek looked at it for a moment. Then he shook it. The crowd went very still. Not because anything dramatic had been said. Nothing had. Not because anyone had made a speech or a gesture, but because there was something in that handshake that the 300 people along the rope barrier recognized without being able to name. Something about the way Clem offered it. Not as reconciliation, not as strategy, but simply as acknowledgement. You are here. I am here. What happens next happens. Derek held the handshake a second longer than necessary. Then both men walked back to their machines. And that's when everything changed. Let me tell you what Clem did before he climbed back up onto the Marshall. He stood at the left side of the machine, reached into the breast pocket of his jacket, and took out the same cloth he'd used that morning to polish the casing. He wiped his hands. Not because they were dirty, they weren't particularly, but in the way a man wipes his hands before he does something that requires his full attention. A small private ritual, the kind that doesn't mean anything to anyone watching and means everything to the man doing it. Then he climbed up, settled into the operator's position, and reached for a valve on the right side of the boiler that he had not touched all morning. It was marked with a strip of red tape, gone pink with age, wrapped twice around the valve handle, and fixed to the pipe just above it, held in place by a single rusted tack, was a small rectangle of card. The writing on it was in pencil, faded to the color of old smoke, in the handwriting of a man who had been dead for 19 years. It said, "Only when it matters." Clem's father, Douglas Radford, had written those 4 words sometime in the 1980s, during a period when he'd been competing with the Marshal at agricultural shows across the Welsh marches. The valve opened a secondary steam feed from the lower section of the boiler, a reserve path that bypassed the main regulator circuit and delivered pressure more directly to the piston chest. It gave the engine a deeper, slower kind of power. Not faster revolutions, not more noise, just more torque, further down in the stroke, where it was hardest to interrupt. Douglas had used it 3 times in competition. He'd won all 3 times. Clem had used it once before today, 14 years ago, at a ploughing match in Herefordshire, where the ground had turned against him in the second hour of work. He'd won that day too, though he'd never spoken much about it. He opened the valve now with 2 slow turns of his wrist. The Marshal didn't roar. It didn't surge or shudder or announce itself. The change was subtler than that, a deepening of the exhaust rhythm, a slight drop in the pitch of the steam release, the way a man's voice drops when he stops performing and starts meaning what he says. The pressure gauge needle moved perhaps 4 pounds to the right and held there, steady. Clem rested both hands on the regulator and waited for Robert Ashby's signal. Now here's what you need to understand about what he'd done with the wrench. The rear axle of the Marshal, like most working traction engines of its era, had a differential, a mechanical system that allows the 2 rear wheels to rotate at slightly different speeds when the machine turns a corner. It's a sensible and necessary piece of engineering for most situations. But in a straight pull, on level ground, a differential introduces a vulnerability. If one wheel meets slightly less resistance than the other, even by a small margin, the differential will allow that wheel to take the path of least resistance and spin faster, which means the opposite wheel, the one with more traction, actually receives less torque. The power goes where it's easiest to go, not where it's most needed. This is a problem as old as the differential itself. The solution is equally old: lock it. Mechanically force both rear wheels to rotate at exactly the same speed, no matter what. Every unit of torque the engine produces goes to both wheels simultaneously, with no negotiation, no averaging, no escape route. What the wrench had done, in those 4 quiet minutes while 300 people watched without understanding, was engage a mechanical differential lock, a physical pin in the axle housing that Clem's father had fitted to the Marshal sometime in the 1970s, and that Clem maintained and used by hand, with that same forged wrench, every time the conditions called for it. No sensor, no software, no system watching for slip and responding to it. Prevention, not reaction. The Fendt, for all its sophistication, and understand that it was genuinely sophisticated, genuinely impressive engineering, managed its differential electronically. The system monitored wheel speed, detected slip when it began, and redistributed torque in response. It was fast. It was accurate. It was, by modern standards, very good at its job. But it could only act after the slip started, in the time between slip beginning and the system correcting it. Fractions of a second, yes, but fractions that exist. Energy was lost. Traction was interrupted. On the hard, dry surface of the pull lane's upper layer, those interruptions accumulated. And this is where Clem's hands in the dirt come back into the story. What he had felt, pressing his palm flat against the pull lane surface, was a temperature difference. The top layer of the packed chalk was warm and dry. The September sun had been on it since early morning, driving out whatever moisture remained. But 3 or 4 inches below that surface, where the chalk gave way to the older clay subsoil beneath, there was still moisture. Not mud, Not softness, just the faint, residual dampness of a subsoil that hadn't seen direct sun since spring. For rubber tires riding on the surface, that moisture was irrelevant. They would never reach it. For iron lug cleats, those long, curved spurs, each one pressing down and forward into the ground with every rotation, that moisture was everything. The cleats would cut through the dry upper layer and find the damp clay beneath. And damp clay grips iron differently than dry chalk. It holds, it anchors, it gives the cleat something to push against that doesn't crumble or compress. With the differential locked and both wheels pulling as one, every cleat on both wheels would find that layer at the same moment, and the torque would have nowhere to go but forward, or rather, backward, in Clem's direction. The horn sounded. Both machines loaded against the chain. For the first 8 seconds, nothing moved. This was different from both previous rounds. There was no initial advantage, no early drift in either direction. The Fendt pushed with everything Derek had calibrated it to produce. The Marshall pushed back with everything Douglas Radford had left behind in pencil on a piece of card. The chain hung between them, vibrating with the tension of two completely different centuries of engineering pressing against each other through 40 feet of hardened steel links. Then at 9 seconds, the chain moved. 1 inch toward Clem's end of the lane, then stopped. Then 2 inches more. Derek felt it immediately. He responded the way a skilled operator responds, smoothly, without overcorrection, feeding more throttle with the precision the machine's management system was designed to support. The Fendt's computer cycled through its adjustments, torque rebalancing, slip detection, traction modulation. It was doing exactly what it had been built to do, and it was doing it well. But the ground under Derek's tires was the same dry, compressed chalk it had been in round 2. And the contact patch, even at reduced pressure, was riding on a surface that had been further compacted and dried by 2 rounds of heavy tractor work. The rubber gripped, released, gripped again in the microsecond rhythms of the traction system's corrections. Grip, release, grip, release. Under the Marshall's iron cleats, 2 inches down in the pale Shropshire clay, there was no such rhythm. There was only hold. The chain moved again, 3 inches, then a steady, slow, irreversible drift. Not dramatic, not sudden, but continuous in the way that geological things are continuous. The sled was following the Marshall now, and the Marshall was not asking for its opinion. Derek pushed to the system's limits. His crew watched in silence. The communications person had stopped filming, not as a decision, just because they'd forgotten to keep doing it. Everyone along the rope barrier had gone very quiet. The way people go quiet when they're watching something they don't fully understand but can feel the weight of. At 38 seconds, the sled crossed the line. Robert Ashby raised his right hand. The horn sounded. 3 seconds passed over that fairground in complete silence. Not the polite quiet of a crowd waiting for an announcement. Not the held breath before a result. A genuine, involuntary collective stillness. The kind that only happens when something has occurred that no one had a ready response to. Then it broke. The sound was enormous for 300 people. Farmers who had not raised their voices in public since their children were born were shouting. Children who didn't fully understand what had happened were shouting because the adults were shouting. 2 elderly women near the far end of the barrier were clapping with the focused intensity of people who understood exactly what they'd seen. Derek sat in the cab of the Fendt with both hands on the wheel and looked at the chain lying slack on the chalk. And Clem Radford, 76 years old, alone, no crew, no sponsors, reached forward and closed the reserve valve with 2 slow turns of his wrist. He eased the main regulator back, let the boiler pressure drop to its resting level, and listened to the Marshall settle into the quieter rhythm of a machine at rest. Then he reached up, took his cap off, and held it in his lap. He didn't stand. He didn't raise a fist. He didn't look at the crowd. He just sat there on the old iron seat, in the steam in the September morning, with his cap in his hands. And for a moment he was very still. And that is not the end of the story. Because what happened in the next 20 minutes, in the quieter space after the noise died down, is the part that tells you what this day was actually about. The pull lane filled from both sides. It happened the way water fills a low place, gradually, then all at once. First the children came, ducking under the rope barrier before any adult thought to stop them. Drawn to the Marshall the way children are drawn to things that are simultaneously enormous and inexplicable. They gathered around the iron wheels, pointing at the lug cleats, reaching out to touch the warm casing and then pulling their hands back with the particular delight of something hotter than expected. Then came their parents, following the children as parents do, and then the older farmers, moving more slowly but with a different quality of attention. The focused, evaluating look of people who recognize the machine, not as a curiosity, but as a predecessor. Something their grandfathers had spoken about in the specific, affectionate language that working men use for working things. Two grandmothers in their 80s made their way to the front of the gathering without any apparent difficulty. One of them placed her hand flat on the boiler casing and left it there for a long time, not saying anything. Later, someone who'd been standing nearby said she'd simply nodded once, as though the machine had confirmed something she'd long suspected. Nobody quite knew what to do with what they'd seen. That's the most honest way to describe the atmosphere in those first minutes. 300 people who had arrived expecting a demonstration of the obvious. New beats old, power beats age, progress beats history, and had received instead something that didn't fit the story they'd brought with them. They weren't disappointed. They were, most of them, genuinely moved. In the slightly bewildered way people are moved when something they'd written off reveals unexpected depth. Like finding a handwritten letter inside a book you bought for 50 pence. On the far side of the pull lane, Derek's crew packed up with the quiet efficiency of professionals doing a job they no longer had their heart in. Equipment cases were latched, cables were coiled, the diagnostic laptop was folded and stored. The communications person had put the tablet away entirely. Nobody was performing anymore. The polo shirts moved with a subdued purposefulness that was not sulking. These were experienced people, and they understood losing, but there was a heaviness to the movements that hadn't been there in the morning. Derek himself was not with them. He was standing at the edge of the pull lane, about 30 feet from the marshal, watching the crowd around the old machine with an expression that was difficult to read from a distance, and by all accounts from people who were closer, not much easier to read up close. He stood there for several minutes, long enough that one of his crew came over to say something to him, and he responded with a short word or two without turning his head, and the crew member went back to the van. Then Derek walked across the lane. The crowd around the marshal noticed him coming and opened without being asked, the way crowds open for someone moving with quiet intention. He stopped in front of Clem, who was still on the machine, still in his seat, the cap now back on his head, the boiler ticking softly as it cooled. Derek looked at the marshal for a moment, at the iron wheels, at the battered toolbox bolted to the side, at the pressure gauge with its cracked glass bezel, at the small rectangle of card fixed to the pipe above the reserve valve, the penciled words still just visible from where he stood. Then he looked up at Clem. He said one word. How? Clem looked at him for a moment with the steady, unhurried gaze of a man who had been asked this question before, in different forms, about different things. Throughout a long life of working with his hands, he climbed down from the machine, slowly, carefully, the way a 76-year-old man climbs down from a 6-ton iron engine. And he stood on the chalk beside Derek Holt, and the two of them were about the same height, and for a few seconds neither spoke. Then Clem said, "Your machine fights the ground." Derek waited. "Mine works with it." Derek looked at the iron wheels again, at the lug cleats, still carrying pale clay in the curves of their angle, at the hand-forged wrench lying on top of the toolbox where Clem had left it after the final round, unhurried, in no rush to put things away. "The differential," Derek said. It wasn't quite a question. Clem nodded. "Locked it by hand. My father fitted the pin in '73. Every machine he ever worked, he understood what it would do before he asked it to do anything." He paused. He said, "A tool that surprises you is a tool you haven't listened to yet." Derek was quiet for a long time. Now here's what you need to understand about that silence. It wasn't the silence of a man who had nothing to say. It was the silence of a man doing something genuinely difficult, revising, updating, taking something he had believed completely and measuring it against something that had just happened, and finding that the measurement required more room than he'd expected. Derek Holt was an intelligent man, intelligent enough to know when he'd been shown something real, and what he'd been shown was not that his machine was inadequate, or that modern engineering was inferior, or that old was better than new in any simple or sweepable sense. What he'd been shown was a gap, not in horsepower, not in technology, in knowledge, specifically in the kind of knowledge that doesn't appear on a specification sheet and can't be downloaded through a diagnostic port. The kind that lives in the hands of a man who has worked the same land through 40 seasons and learned to read it the way some people read faces, not by analysis, but by accumulated, embodied, unrepeatable familiarity. Clem hadn't needed a sensor to tell him about the moisture in the subsoil. He'd felt it through his palm in 15 seconds, because he had been feeling ground like that his entire life, and his father before him had been feeling it. And somewhere in the motion of pressing a hand flat against cold earth, there was a transmission of understanding that no system yet built could replicate or replace. Derek looked at the yellowed card above the reserve valve. Only when it matters. He read it twice. "Your father wrote that," he said. 1984, Clem said. "We were at a show in Montgomery. Ground turned on us in the second round, same as today. He opened that valve and we won the pull." He looked at the card with the expression of a man who has looked at something 10,000 times and still finds it worth looking at. "He died in 2005. I've kept it where he put it." Derek nodded slowly. "I've got 340 sensors on that machine," he said, and there was no bitterness in it, just a kind of honest reckoning. "Live data on everything. Torque, slip, pressure, temperature, fuel flow, ground reaction. I can see everything that machine is doing in real time." He paused. "I couldn't feel what you felt with your hand." Clem looked at him without any triumph on his face. "No," he said simply. "Not yet." And that two-word answer, "not yet," is the thing several people who were standing within earshot have mentioned separately when they've told this story. Not a dismissal, not a consolation, a genuine acknowledgement that the gap was real but not permanent. That knowledge travels if you're willing to go toward it with your hands open rather than your arguments ready. Derek shook Clem's hand a second time. Then he walked back across the lane to his crew, and within 20 minutes the Fent was loaded, and the convoy was pulling out of the fairground gate, and the polo shirts were gone, and the social media presence of the event had gone quiet. Clem stayed another 2 hours. He answered questions from the farmers who came to him with the specific, practical curiosity of people who work the land and wanted to understand what they'd seen. He showed 2 younger men how the differential lock pin worked, crouching beside the axle with the old wrench in his hand, explaining in the plain language of someone who has taught things before. He let the children sit in the operator's seat one at a time while he stood beside them, a hand on the iron rail, and told them what the gauges meant. At 1:30, with the fairground beginning to empty and the catering van starting to pack away, Clem loaded the Marshall back onto the flatbed trailer by himself. He chained it down with the same practice movements he'd used in the darkness before sunrise. He checked the tension on each chain. He folded the loading ramps and secured them. He climbed into the cab of his old truck and he drove west out of Ludlow, back toward Clune. Back toward the small holding his grandfather had farmed. Back toward the land he knew better than he knew almost anything else in the world. Robert Ashby found him just before he left and shook his hand and said something about it being the finest thing the fairground had seen in 20 years. Clem thanked him quietly and meant it. And this is the image I want to leave you with. Not the moment the chain crossed the line. Not the eruption of 300 voices over a Shropshire field. Not Derek's face when he read the penciled note, or the children on the iron seat, or the 2 old women nodding at the warm boiler casing. This, the old wrench, lying on top of the toolbox on the side of the Marshall as it was loaded onto the trailer, hand-forged, dark with decades of use, shaped by someone in a workshop that no longer exists, for a task that most people alive today have never had reason to perform. No serial number, no manufacturer's mark visible, just iron, worked into a form that fit a specific need, passed from a father's hands to a son's, carried across a century of mornings exactly like this one. It didn't know it had won anything. It was just a tool that had been listened to. And that, in the end, is the whole story.